Hi guys, it's Nick, and today on Relaxing Reviews, we're going to be talking all about mechanical keyboards. This video is intended to be a beginner's guide to mechanical keyboards, and so if you are an expert, if you know all about mechanical keyboards, then you can shut your brain off, stop listening. If you like, just fall asleep. You can all do that if you really want. But really, this video is intended for those of you who have maybe heard of mechanical keyboards before, but don't really know what they are or why you might want one. Or for those of you who have maybe done a little bit of research into mechanical keyboards, but are overwhelmed or confused by the vast array of options and the terminology that comes along with these things. You know, you've got all these different like sizes of keyboards and all these different switch types, red and blue and brown, and what the heck does that all mean? So my goal today is to bring some clarity to that stuff, and to help you select the mechanical keyboard or the type of mechanical keyboard that is ideal for your particular needs. So let's start with the basics right at the beginning. What exactly is a mechanical keyboard, and how does it differ from a conventional keyboard, the type that most people are used to using? So a mechanical keyboard is simply a keyboard that has a little mechanical switch under each key. And that mechanical switch and the mechanism inside is responsible for registering the key presses and providing tactile feedback to the user so that they know that the key has been depressed. In a conventional low-cost keyboard, the kind you might buy for $15 from Staples, or that might come as a pack-in with your pre-built, Dell PC or something like that. In these conventional low-cost boards, there is a membrane, a rubber membrane that runs underneath all the keycaps, and that's why these are called membrane-style keyboards. And under each individual keycap is a little rubber dome, and when you press down on the key, that rubber dome inverts and contact is made with a little metal contact underneath, and that registers your key press. And this works quite well, and certainly these keyboards have their place. Yeah, they, as I mentioned, they are very, very cheap to produce, and they're good enough for most people, which begs the question: do I really need a mechanical keyboard? And of course, the answer is no. You don't need a mechanical keyboard, but you want a mechanical keyboard. And part of this video today is going to be explaining why and demonstrating why that is. But broadly speaking, mechanical keyboards have three major advantages over membrane-based keyboards. The first is that they feel way better to use, and the performance is better overall. They're just more satisfying, and most people, given their choice, will say, yeah, I would way rather type and game on these mechanical switches. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a couple of minutes when we take a closer look at some mechanical switches. The second major advantage of mechanical keyboards over conventional membrane boards is longevity. These mechanical switches last for a long time. They're typically rated for like 50 million keystrokes individually, which is going to take you quite a while to burn through. And as a matter of fact, if you're willing to get your hands a little bit dirty, you can in fact replace individual mechanical switches if they happen to fail, instead of replacing your whole keyboard. So longevity and durability. The third advantage is customizability. And that's where this whole plethora of different options comes in. You can tweak your keyboard to be exactly what you want it to be by picking the switch type, selecting the size. If you really want, you can get into things like custom keycaps for aesthetics and feel, a custom case, lighting, the whole shebang. You can go down that rabbit hole, and that goes very deep. And we're not really going into the depths of that today. I'm going to keep it simple here today. I will say that if that interests you, the idea of building your own custom mechanical keyboard from the ground up, I highly suggest you go check out the Mechanical Keyboards subreddit. It's a really cool community where people are very supportive. It's quite informative, and you can ogle some really beautiful keyboards there if that's something you're into. But for today, we're going to keep it simple. The plan is to talk about 3 of the predominant mechanical switch types that I would say probably make up like 90% of all off-the-shelf keyboards that you're going to be shopping for. And then we'll talk a little bit about sizes and form factors of keyboards as well. To help with that today, I'm going to be using this little switch set right here, which was very kindly provided by our friends at banggood.com, who have also provided some of the keyboards and other items that I've reviewed previously on this channel. And this little switch tester set here has 4 genuine Cherry MX switches in a little plastic frame, and these clear key caps on top. This thing cost about $4 US, $4.50 or something like that. And so if you are interested in trying before you go and drop $60, $70, $80, $100 on a mechanical keyboard, picking up one of these is not a bad idea at all. And it gives you a feel for what these different switch types feel like under the fingers and how they respond. And so, of course, there will be a link down in the video description to Banggood, where you can purchase this little tester set. This is one of the cheapest tester sets that I've found, actually. And like I said, they are genuine Cherry MX switches, which is nice. So we're going to take a closer look at 3 of the 4 switches in this tester set. And that's because one of these is a bit of an oddball. It's a switch type that you very rarely see on boards, and it's actually very similar to another switch type here. So anyway, let's take a closer look at some mechanical keyboard switches. So I have here 3 different mechanical switches, individual switches. They've had the keycaps removed, and they've been taken out of their little frame that I showed you there a moment ago. So this is the naked switch. One of these sits under each individual key on a mechanical keyboard. Now these switches, as I mentioned a moment ago, are Cherry MX switches. Now Cherry is a manufacturer of mechanical keyboard switches. It's been around since the 80s, I believe, and for a long time it actually held the patent on this type of mechanical switch. That patent expired in 2014, and since then there's been a explosion of Cherry MX Switch clones. Lots of Chinese makes, things like Outemu switches, Kale, Gatoron, and a whole bunch of other names, Greetech, tons. And those switches are based off of these Cherry designs, and their characteristics are generally very similar. Now, Cherry color codes their switches, and each color corresponds to a different internal mechanism and a different response, a different feel for the switch. Today we have here a Cherry MX Blue switch, a Cherry MX Brown switch, if it's going to, there we are, and a Cherry MX Red switch. So when you're shopping for keyboards, most of the major brand names, the big ones like Logitech, Corsair, they use these genuine Cherry MX switches. A lot of direct from China brands, in fact a lot of the keyboards that I've reviewed on this very channel use the Chinese clones, but they use the same color coding system, and the response for each color-coded switch type is quite similar. So an Outemu Blue switch is going to perform an awful lot like a Cherry MX Blue switch. Now, if you're really into this stuff, there are, of course, subtle differences, and some people prefer Cherry switches, some people prefer some of these clones. For various reasons. That's beyond the scope of this video, so we're not going to dive into that right now, but there's information about that online if you're so inclined to go seek that stuff out. But as for Cherry's switches, the genuine Cherry switches, each of these is rated for 50 million keystrokes, that's what Cherry states, and each of them has 4 millimeters of total travel. So travel is the distance that the key can be depressed before it bottoms out. 4 millimeters. And each of these keys, furthermore, will actuate, which means it will register the keystroke halfway down. So 2 millimeters down. So 2 millimeter actuation point, 4 millimeters total travel distance. So let's look at some of these individually and talk about some of the unique characteristics of each of these switches. First up, we're going to talk about Cherry's MX Blue switch. There we go. The blue switch is perhaps the most iconic switch that Cherry makes. It is one that you see on a whole lot of keyboards, both marketed towards professionals and typists as well as gamers. And it's what many people think of when they think of a mechanical keyboard and a mechanical switch. Cherry's MX Blue switch is what they call a clicky switch. And you can hear why there. It has a very distinct click when it's depressed, which is quite satisfying. Now this click is produced by an internal mechanism. It is a two-part sliding mechanism, or a two-piece sliding mechanism solution that results in that click that you hear. And I'll put a GIF up here that will show you internally what's happening there. So you can see how the slider is creating that click. So the benefit of that is that you get a really nice, satisfying tactile response every time you press down on one of these keys. which just feels great under the fingers. And for that reason, Cherry's MX Blues are favored by typists. They're excellent typing switches. However, there are some drawbacks. One is that they're kind of loud. And if you are in a noise-sensitive environment, somewhere like an office, maybe they're not ideal. That's up for you to decide, obviously. Personally, I find that when I'm typing, after a very short amount of time, I no longer notice the noise that they make. Like, it just becomes part of the background noise. And it's honestly kind of satisfying and soothing in a way. But it's something to keep in mind. Something else about the MX Blue switches is that they have a relatively stiff actuation force. It takes about 60 grams peak force to depress one of these switches to get it over the little click. And that's on the high end, and so if you're prone to finger fatigue, you might have challenges with Cherry's MX Blue switch. You might find it just a little bit too stiff for your liking, take too much force under the finger to actuate. Personally, I find it just fine, but again, it's on the stiffer end. It is the heaviest switch in terms of the actuation force that we're going to be looking at today. And finally, for gaming, it can occasionally be problematic when trying to double tap a switch, a blue switch. And that's because of how the internal mechanism works. The recovery point actually sits higher than the actuation point. And so if you're trying to do a very quick double tap, sometimes you can get into trouble where the switch hasn't registered that you've let off of it yet. Not a problem for most people, but if you're really looking for maximum performance, it might be an issue for you. Nonetheless, Cherry's MX Blues are marketed towards gamers, and I would say, in fact, that the majority of the keyboards that I see, sort of the mainstream pre-built boards, come with a blue switch of some kind, whether it's a Cherry or an Otemu or whatever it might be. So that is Cherry's MX Blue switch. Let's take a little typing test here, go for a little typing test where we can hear Cherry's MX Blue switches in action. And for this demo, I'm going to be typing on the Drivo Excalibur keyboard, which I've reviewed in past. So let's go have a listen. Next up, we're going to take a look at Cherry's MX Brown switch. That's this little guy right here. So the MX Brown switch differs from the blue switch in a couple of key ways. This is what Cherry calls a tactile switch. Not a clicky switch, but a tactile switch. And what it has is a little bump inside that provides a small amount of tactile feedback so that you can feel when the switch has been actuated, but it doesn't have that same snap that the blue switches do, and it's not a two-part mechanism like the blue switches are either. But you can still hear, if you listen carefully, that tactile bump that results in that feeling under your fingers, that little that little bump that lets you know that you've actuated the switch. So this is a much quieter switch overall for that reason than Cherry's MX Blue, and is more appropriate for office settings. Audible, but much more toned down than the blue switches. It also has a slightly lower actuation force. The peak force required to actuate this switch is 55 grams, so a little bit less than the 60 grams of the blues. Cherry's MX Browns have a reputation for being a great middle ground switch that's great for both gaming and typing because you get the satisfying tactile feedback when typing, but it doesn't have the same issues with the double tapping as the blue switches, because the actuation point and the recovery point sit at the same point in the travel. So personally, I love Cherry's MX Browns. I think they're a great blend of being tactile and nice feeling under the fingers, while still being practical for gaming and not being too obnoxiously loud. So let's take a listen now to a board with Cherry's MX Brown switches. This is going to be my trusty old Corsair K70. The third and final switch that we're going to be examining here today is Cherry's MX Red switch. This little guy right here. The MX Red switch is interesting because it has no click, it has no bump. It is a linear switch, which means it has uninterrupted action all the way down, perfectly linear across its travel distance. And this means that it is quite well suited to gaming, because it is a very quick switch. And as a matter of fact, it's also a fairly light switch, the lightest of the switches that we're looking at here today, at a mere 45 grams actuation force, as compared to the 55 grams peak force on the brown switch and the 60 grams peak force on the blue switch. So it takes less effort to press, and it rebounds very quickly. And so you will often see Cherry MX Red switches or variants marketed to gamers in gaming keyboards, less so to typists, because lacking that tactile bump or that click means that it is not quite as satisfying to type on. Still completely functional, of course, and some people perhaps prefer that linear response when typing, but I, for one, really love having some kind of tactile feedback when the key actuates, as do many others. So more of a gamer switch than a typer's switch, but still perfectly capable of both. And you can hear that sound you hear is just the rebound, just the stem rebounding and bumping against the casing. But the actual action is perfectly silent. So the only sound you're going to hear when typing with these is potentially when you bottom out, the keycaps bumping into the back plate of the board, and that rebound sound. So these are very quiet switches, and they are quite appropriate for a quiet office environment. There are variants of the red switch, also, which Cherry calls, I think they're MX silent switches, which are designed to be even quieter. So if you are in a very sound sensitive environment, you might consider those. So now let's have a listen to some red switches in action. Now it so happens that I don't actually have a keyboard with Cherry's MX red switches. I know, shocker. In my menagerie of keyboards, I don't have one yet. But what I do have is a keyboard from a company called Bloody, called the B820R. And you guys haven't seen this board yet because I haven't reviewed it yet, but you'll get to see it in detail in an upcoming video down the road a bit. But what it has is red analogs, or similar switches, red-like switches. They use a different technology than Cherry's switches. They are optical switches. They call them their light strike switches, which means that they use a beam of infrared light to determine when the switch is depressed and actuated, which is quite different from the mechanism inside Cherry's switches. And Bloody claims that it makes this keyboard very, very fast, with incredibly fast response times. We'll find out when it comes time to test it. But the keys on this particular board are designed to emulate the feel of a Cherry MX red switch with that linear response and light actuation force. And so typing on it should feel and sound an awful lot like typing on a board with Cherry MX reds. So let's go have a listen to typing on some red switches on Bloody's B820R keyboard. Okay, so are you still with me after all that switch talk? That's a lot of information, and switches are sort of the meat and potatoes, the heart of your keyboard, your mechanical keyboard. And we only looked at 3 switch types here today, of course, the Cherry MX Blue, Brown, and Red. But there are many other types out there, Cherry MX Black, clears, greens, as well as all kinds of custom switches from other companies, many of them more exotic in their construction and design. But like I said, between those 3 switches we looked at today, I would say you have like 90% of all off-the-shelf keyboards covered out there. Certainly all the ones from like your major manufacturers. And even if it's not the exact type of switch, it'll be similar or very close to one of the 3 switches we looked at here today. But with all that switch talk out of the way, let's quickly talk about keyboard size. It turns out here that maybe bigger isn't always better. But that's really up for you to decide. Everyone has their own needs and preferences when it comes to size. So let's start off with your standard full-size keyboard. This here is the keyboard, a type of keyboard that most people are familiar with. This is a standard layout 108 key full-size keyboard. This particular board is the Moto Speed CK103, which I reviewed in a video previously. You may have seen it. And this is quite representative of a typical full-size keyboard. It's got space between the number rows and the F keys It's got a little bit of space up top here. Everything is, nicely spaced out. And as I said, this is what most people have experience with, but it is certainly not the only keyboard form factor available. Let's take a look at something a little bit smaller. So next up I have what's known as a 10 keyless, or sometimes abbreviated to TKL keyboard design. And you can see that it is quite literally just a full-size keyboard with the numpad cut off. So you're lacking your numpad keys over here. But functionally, it's really similar to a full-size keyboard, especially because the functionality of numpad keys are 100% redundant with other keys elsewhere on the board. So with a 10 keyless design, you're not really losing any functionality. Now, some people really like to have that numpad, and I admit it's really handy when you're doing calculations quickly or inputting a lot of data rapidly. And for those individuals, a full-size keyboard makes a lot of sense. But if you're a gamer primarily and you don't do that kind of thing very often, you're not doing a lot of data entry or what have you, then a 10 keyless board makes a lot of sense. And what you gain by dropping the numpad is significantly more space on your desktop where it counts, right where your mouse is going to be. Now, I never used to think that I was bothered by a full-size keyboard layout and the space it takes up, but having used a variety of keyboards over the last while, I actually find that reclaiming that space and being able to position the keyboard such that I can have my mouse a little closer in feels much more ergonomically sound to me. It's just more comfortable, and where my hands naturally sit is right where I want them to be in terms of where my mouse and keyboard sit. So I think that the 10 keyless design is actually perhaps the sweet spot for a lot of gamers, and you'll find that there are a lot of mechanical keyboards out there these days that adopt this 10 keyless design, and as a matter of fact they're often a bit cheaper as well. So well worth considering if gaming is your primary motive with these mechanical keyboards, or if typing is but you don't make regular use of that numpad. You'll sometimes also see these loud blue switches there. You'll sometimes also see these 10 keyless boards referred to as 80% keyboards, because they're sort of like 80% the size or the width of a typical 104 key board. So 10 keyless, TKL, 80%, regardless of what you call it, you get some space savings with this type of board. This specific board, by the way, is the Mechanical Eagle Z77 board with Outemu blue switches. You can hear that click, that snap right there that's characteristic of the blue switches. This is another board that I have not yet reviewed, but you will see in an upcoming review. So 10 keyless boards, check them out. Let's go a little bit smaller. Okay, now things are getting interesting. We're dropping down to what's called a 70 or sometimes 75% keyboard. This here is the Drivo Excalibur, which you just saw and listened to a little bit ago in the Cherry MX Blue typing sound sample there. And this is a board that I have reviewed in a previous video that you can go check out if you're interested as well. But what we basically have here is a 10 keyless board minus a few additional keys and then squished down to be about as compact as you can be, given the functionality of the board here and the key layout. once again, of course, we have no keypad over here, no numpad. We've also lost our arrow key cluster and our navigation cluster up above that, and they've been sort of squashed into the sidelines here, right along the right-hand margin of the board. In doing so, we've lost a couple of keys. We've lost our scroll lock, we've lost our insert key, and things like that, but those functions are still accessible on another function layer. So this is where we introduce the concept of function layers. You'll notice we have an FN key right here. And so what we can do is hold down the FN key and then press a number of these switches to access our secondary function layer. And you can see that on this particular board, the legend for the second function layer is printed on the side of the keycaps. It's a clever way of keeping the tops less cluttered. And in fact, you will notice that we in fact have an entire numpad in terms of functionality here on our second layer, as well as some of our missing functionality, like our insert keys and things like that up here. And so if space is at a premium on your desk, but you'd still like to have all that functionality of a numpad and all the keys that you'd normally expect on a full-size board, you can get that with a 70% or 75% board. You'll find these called both, at least in my experience. But essentially, it's a 10 keyless board that's been squashed down to be as compact as possible. We're not done yet though. We can go smaller. So let's take a look at something smaller. Okay, for this one I'm going to switch over to the left side to give your right ear a break, because I've been droning on in that ear for a while. At this point we're down to this right here. This is the Obens and Pro, which is another board that I have reviewed on this channel. You might want to go check it out, because I really quite like this board, and in fact I'm using it as my daily driver right now. This is what we call a 60% board, and as you can see, it has some similarities to the 70 or 75% board, but we're smaller still. The main losses here are along the top. You see we're lacking our dedicated F keys, and along the right hand margin of the board here we're lacking our dedicated arrow keys and our navigation keys, like our page up, page down, insert, and things like that. So as with our 70% board, those functions are accessible on a secondary function layer, and we have here our function button that allows us to access that layer. So for instance, we can hold down function and WASD become our arrow keys. And similarly, hold down function and our number row becomes our F keys, our function keys up there. And so really, once again, we've managed to maintain most of the functionality of a full-size keyboard while squishing it down into a very tiny footprint. I mean, you can see I can basically cover the entirety of this keyboard at once under my two hands here. And this, of course, reclaims a bit more desktop space. Also, it's easy to travel with a board like this. And the Obens and Pro in particular is actually a wireless, a Bluetooth wireless keyboard. It can do wired as well, but in wireless mode, it's great to have something so small that you can just lift up off your desk, and you can just place it in your lap, or you can just kind of hold it in your hand or whatever you want to do with it. It's a very flexible size, and I'll tell you, it feels great under the hands. I just really like having something so compact, so space efficient. It just frees up, liberates so much room on my desktop. For those of you wondering, since we've been talking about switches today, the Obens N Pro has Gatoron brown switches, which are, of course, designed to emulate Cherry's MX Brown switches with that tactile bump. And they do a good job of it. I would go so far as to say they actually outdo Cherry at their own game, because they feel a bit smoother than Cherry's switches, which I personally really love. So the Gatoron Browns are lovely switches that are quite similar to Cherry's MX Browns. So 60% is the end of the line for the boards that I have here that I can show you. There are smaller boards out there, and now we're getting into really like boutique type boards that are usually custom built. But you can find 40% boards out there, which actually chop out even more of these keys. You lose your dedicated number row, and instead that goes onto a function row on your number key or your letter keys here, your QWERTY row, and other things like that, other ways of squashing it down even smaller. But of course, at some point you do start dropping functionality, or that functionality becomes quite buried under multiple function layers. So I have not yet used or reviewed a 40% keyboard, but if you were to go to the mechanical keyboard subreddit that I mentioned earlier, you will see that 40% boards are very like hipster trendy right now. And certainly a lot of these people building custom boards are opting for the 40% option just for the novelty and for the visual interest of the thing. Personally, I think that somewhere between 60% and the 10 keyless design is the sweet spot for most people, depending on how much you value compactness and value having a nice uncluttered open desk space. But all of these are options, right from the full-size 108 key keyboard down to these little 60% and even 40% boards. And what is best for you, it depends upon how much space you have, where you like to put your mousing hand, and how much you value having a nice uncluttered desk in front of you. All things to consider, of course, when you're looking to go purchase a keyboard. Also worth considering that you're going to find more options in the larger sizes, like the full size and 10 keyless. There's more options available typically than in these smaller, like 70%, 60% boards. So that will do it for talking about keyboard sizes and form factors. Now there's a couple of other things that I'd like to talk about quickly here. A little bit of terminology and some other odds and ends that you might encounter when looking to purchase a mechanical keyboard. So a few other quick considerations when you're shopping around for a mechanical keyboard. One thing that you might hear mentioned or read about is called N-key rollover, which is often abbreviated to NKRO. And what that's referring to is how many buttons you can have held down simultaneously before the keyboard stops registering additional inputs pressed. And N-key rollover is referring to the fact that you can hold down as many as you want, an unlimited number of buttons or keys, and it will still register additional ones. In a practical sense, you really probably don't need more than like 5, 6, maybe 7 key rollover to be completely functional, because let's be honest, you're not going to be holding down more than that many keys at a given time in any regular usage case. Even gaming, where you might have like certainly 3, maybe 4 keys held down at once. But beyond that, you're starting to get into more just the theoretical. But certainly it's desirable to look for higher key rollover, like 7, 8 key or unlimited N key rollover. So that's something to be aware of when you're purchasing anyway. Another thing that you might encounter is backlighting. RGB, holy cow, RGB is all the rage these days. If you're a touch typist, backlighting isn't so important because even in a dark room, you're not going to be looking at your hands anyway. So it doesn't matter whether the board is illuminated or not, unless you're into the aesthetic side of it. And certainly RGB lighting is all about the aesthetics, really. Different keyboards have different options. If you've watched keyboard reviews on my channel, you know that you can get different like patterns of flashing lights and ripple effects and breathing effects and rainbows and all kinds of really gaudy stuff, which quite frankly you don't need. And you never probably really want to use because it's just kind of distracting. Really, it's fun for showing off to your friends or as a neat little demo. But in practical terms, all you really need is a fixed backlight, really single color, like a white backlight as far as I'm concerned is fine, but it is nice to be able to configure the color of the backlight to match your other peripherals like your mouse or your case lights or what have you. So if you want the ability to configure the color, you want to look for an RGB backlight on your mechanical keyboard. So after all that, where does that leave us? I think I've talked enough about the different options available to you, and I think as a beginner's guide, we've covered most of what needs to be understood and said here. Let's summarize really quickly. When you're looking to buy a mechanical keyboard, the first thing you want to consider is probably switch type. And there are 3 predominant switch types. You've got your blue switches, which are clicky and loud. They have a high actuation force, which results in a fairly heavy typing feel. But that clicky response is just lovely when it comes to typing. It just feels so good. Moving down a little bit, we have our brown switch types, which have a 55 gram peak actuation force, so a bit lighter than the blues. They are certainly quieter, and they have a little tactile bump to them. The browns represent a great middle ground between the highly clicky, loud, heavy blue switches and the light, linear, quiet red switches. And personally, I really love the brown switches, but of course, personal preference, your mileage may vary. But browns are an excellent compromise for people who are doing a lot of typing and a lot of gaming. Finally, we have the red style switches, which have a perfectly linear response, no tactile bump, no click. They have a low actuation force at 45 grams, and of course they are very quiet. Often marketed as a gamer's switch, they're also perfectly usable for typing, but maybe not quite as satisfying because you don't get that nice tactile response like you do with the brown switches or the blue switches. Between these 3 switch types, you've got the vast majority of the keyboards out there covered. The next decision you have to make is whether you want a full-size keyboard, a 10 keyless, or something a bit smaller, more compact, more interesting perhaps. There's lots of options out there, but the most variety is to be found in the full-size and 10 keyless size range. And I highly recommend considering a 10 keyless option or something around that size, because you preserve the functionality of a full-size keyboard, but I think that they're more ergonomically sound. They're more comfortable to use if you're not a regular user of the numpad, at least. And ultimately, there's all kinds of other options that you can look at as well, like RGB backlighting, build materials like metal versus plastic, and of course make warranty. There's a ton of other factors that you can consider when looking at a mechanical keyboard. I strongly encourage you to look up reviews of keyboards before you buy them, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on the big tech websites. There's a review for pretty much every keyboard out there. And of course, there's user reviews on websites like Amazon, like Banggood, that can give you a really good idea of what that keyboard has to offer and whether it's worth it at a particular price point. So, wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. I really hope that this has shed some clarity on mechanical keyboards, what they are, what the benefits are over a typical membrane board, why you might want to pick one up, and if you do decide to take the plunge, what to look for in terms of switches, form factor, and a handful of other features as well. We've barely scratched the surface, really. If you want to get deep into this, like I've mentioned a couple of times, there are online communities out there, and I think the mechanical keyboards subreddit is a great place to start. I will warn you, the rabbit hole goes deep, and if you want to get into fully custom boards, that's absolutely an option. Potentially expensive option, but a potentially rewarding option. And this is something that I'm looking into right now. I think my next step is going to be to build my own fully custom mechanical keyboard. But we'll save that for another day and perhaps another video. I would like to extend special thanks to Banggood.com, of course, for providing that tester set of switches that we took a close look at today. Certainly a great idea if you would like to get a better feel for what these switches are like. Go ahead, pick up a tester set. I will put, again, a link down in the video description if you'd like to pick up the set that we looked at here today. And try them out to get a better feel for what those different switch types are like before you invest in a keyboard of your own. So thank you all so much for watching today. I really hope you found this relaxing. I hope you found it informative. I hope that armed with this newfound knowledge, you will be able to go forth and pick out a mechanical keyboard that's going to be just perfect for you. Thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it, and I look very forward to having you all back here next time on another episode of Relaxing Reviews. Bye for now.